Sarah Mitchell had always been a fighter. At 28, she worked as a nurse in a small hospital in rural Afghanistan, helping wounded soldiers and local civilians. The war had been going on for years, but Sarah felt called to serve. She wanted to make a difference in a place where hope seemed lost. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Sarah was working her usual shift when the ground started shaking. The Taliban had launched a surprise attack on the medical compound. Explosions echoed through the halls as Sarah tried to help patients evacuate. She was running toward the emergency exit when a massive bomb went off right outside the building. The blast threw Sarah against a concrete wall with tremendous force. Her body crumpled to the ground as debris fell all around her. A heavy beam crashed down, pinning her legs. Blood streamed down her face as she tried to call for help, but her voice was too weak. The building was collapsing and smoke filled the air. Other medical staff who survived the attack searched frantically for survivors. They found several injured people, but the area where Sarah had been was completely destroyed. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal made it impossible to search properly. After 3 hours of dangerous rescue efforts, the team leader made a difficult decision. The building was too unstable, and more attacks were expected. The rescue team reported that Sarah Mitchell was missing and presumed dead. Her body could not be recovered due to the dangerous conditions. The military officials processed the paperwork quickly. Within 24 hours, Sarah was officially declared killed in action. Her family back in Ohio received the devastating news that their daughter had died serving her country. The military held a memorial service for Sarah and 2 other workers who died in the attack. Her parents, John and Mary Mitchell, flew to Dover Air Force Base to receive what they believed was their daughter's body. The flag-draped coffin was heavy, and they never questioned what was inside. Their hearts were broken as they buried their only child in Riverside Cemetery. Sarah's friends and colleagues mourned her loss. Newspapers wrote stories about the brave nurse who died helping others. Her nursing school created a scholarship in her name. Everyone who knew Sarah believed she was gone forever. The grave marker read, "Sarah Mitchell, beloved daughter and hero, 1995-2023. But something remarkable had happened during those first critical hours after the explosion. When the beam fell on Sarah's legs, it had also created a small protective space around her upper body. She was trapped but alive, buried under tons of rubble in what had become an accidental underground shelter. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness for the first 2 days. Her legs were badly injured and she had lost a lot of blood. She had no food or water, and the space was completely dark. The air was thick and dusty, making it hard to breathe. Every part of her body hurt, but she was determined to survive. As the days passed, Sarah's survival instincts kicked in. She found small puddles of water that had formed from broken pipes. She rationed these tiny amounts carefully. Her medical training helped her understand what was happening to her body. She knew she was getting weaker, but she refused to give up hope. The worst part was the silence. Sarah could hear nothing from the outside world. She had no idea if anyone was looking for her or if they even knew she was alive. She called out for help whenever she had the strength, but her voice seemed to disappear into the darkness. Still, she kept calling, believing that someone might hear her. Days turned into weeks and Sarah's condition grew more desperate. She had lost significant weight, and her injured legs were becoming infected. She used strips of her torn clothing to bandage her wounds as best she could. Sometimes she hallucinated from dehydration and exhaustion, but deep in her heart she held on to the belief that rescue would come. Back in Ohio, Sarah's parents were struggling with their grief. John Mitchell had taken leave from his job at the auto plant, and Mary could barely get out of bed most days. They visited Sarah's grave every morning, bringing fresh flowers and talking to their daughter as if she could hear them. The pain of losing their only child felt unbearable. 3 weeks after the funeral, John was sitting in Sarah's old bedroom when something strange happened. He could have sworn he heard her voice calling for help. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Mary thought her husband was losing his mind from grief, but John insisted he had heard their daughter. That night, John had a vivid dream where Sarah was trapped somewhere dark, begging for rescue. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, a new Navy SEAL team had arrived to investigate recent Taliban activity in the area. Team leader Commander Jake Rodriguez was briefing his 6-man squad about their mission. They were supposed to search the destroyed medical compound for intelligence and weapons that might have been left behind. The military had avoided the area for weeks because it was considered too dangerous. The SEAL team approached the ruined compound carefully. The building was a twisted mass of concrete and metal. Weeds had already started growing through the cracks. Rodriguez divided his team into pairs to search different sections. The mission was supposed to take only a few hours, but they needed to be thorough. Corporal Mike Chen and Sergeant David Price were assigned to search the eastern section where the medical wing had been. This was the area that had suffered the worst damage from the bombing. The two men moved slowly through the debris, using special equipment to detect any signs of explosives or hidden weapons. As they worked, Chen thought he heard something unusual. He stopped and held up his hand, signaling Price to freeze. Both men listened carefully to the silence around them. Then they heard it again, a faint tapping sound coming from deep beneath the rubble. It was rhythmic, like someone trying to send a signal. Price suggested it might be settling concrete or metal expanding in the heat. But Chen had been on enough rescue missions to recognize the pattern. Someone was tapping 3 short taps, then 3 long taps, then 3 short taps again. It was Morse code for SOS, the International Distress Signal. The two SEALs immediately called Rodriguez on their radio. Within minutes, the entire team had gathered around the spot where the sounds were coming from. Rodriguez ordered everyone to remain completely quiet while they listened. The tapping came again, weak but definitely deliberate. Someone was alive down there. Rodriguez faced a difficult decision. His team was not equipped for a major rescue operation. They would need heavy machinery and construction experts to safely move the massive concrete slabs. But the tapping was getting weaker, suggesting that whoever was trapped might not survive much longer. He decided to call for emergency backup while his team started moving smaller pieces of debris by hand. As the SEALs worked, they tried to communicate with the person trapped below. They tapped back on the concrete and the response came immediately. The trapped person was definitely conscious and trying to signal. Rodriguez used his radio to tap out simple questions in Morse code, asking if the person was injured and how many people were trapped. The responses were weak but clear. One person, injured but alive. The SEALs realized they might be dealing with a survivor from the original attack, someone who had been given up for dead weeks ago. The excitement among the team was mixed with concern. If someone had been trapped for this long, they would be in critical condition. Sarah, deep in her underground prison, could barely believe what was happening. She had been tapping the SOS signal for days, hoping against hope that someone might hear. When the answering taps came from above, she cried tears of joy and relief. Someone knew she was alive. Someone was coming to help her. The sound of voices above gave Sarah new strength. She tapped back as loudly as she could, trying to let her rescuers know exactly where she was. Her voice was too weak to shout, but she could still use her hands to signal. She had never lost faith that this moment would come, but now that it was happening, it felt like a miracle. The rescue operation began immediately, but it would prove to be one of the most challenging missions the SEAL team had ever faced. Commander Rodriguez called in engineers, medical specialists, and heavy equipment operators. Within 6 hours, the destroyed compound was buzzing with activity as dozens of rescue workers arrived from the nearest military base. The first challenge was determining exactly where Sarah was trapped and how to reach her safely. Ground-penetrating radar showed that she was buried under at least 15 feet of concrete and steel beams. The space she was in appeared to be very small, barely large enough for one person. Any mistake in removing the debris could cause the entire section to collapse further. Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma surgeon, was flown in specifically for this rescue. She had experience treating people who had been trapped for extended periods. Dr. Foster explained to the team that if someone had truly been buried for 3 weeks, they would be suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and possibly organ failure. Every minute counted. The engineering team, led by Captain Robert Hayes, developed a careful plan. They would need to remove the debris piece by piece, starting from the top and working down. Each concrete slab would have to be lifted using cranes while support beams were installed to prevent collapse. The process would take many hours, possibly days. As the heavy machinery moved into position, the SEALs maintained constant communication with Sarah through the tapping system. They had learned that her name was Sarah, and that she was a nurse who had been working in the medical wing when the attack happened. The news that she had already been declared dead and buried created shockwaves through the military command. Rodriguez immediately contacted his superiors to report the situation. Within hours, the news had reached the Pentagon and then Sarah's family in Ohio. John Mitchell was at work when he received the phone call that would change everything. At first, he thought it was a cruel joke. His daughter was dead and buried. They had attended her funeral 3 weeks ago. Mary Mitchell fainted when John told her the news. The possibility that their daughter might be alive was too overwhelming to process. They had grieved for her, held a funeral, and were trying to learn how to live without her. Now they were being told that Sarah might have been fighting for her life underground while they were mourning her death. The military offered to fly the Mitchells to Afghanistan immediately, but the doctors advised against it. Sarah's condition was critical, and if the rescue was successful, she would need to be transported to a major medical facility immediately. It would be better for the family to wait at Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland, where Sarah would be taken if she survived. Back at the rescue site, the work continued around the clock. Powerful lights were brought in so the operation could continue through the night. The rescue team worked in shifts, with some crews operating the heavy machinery, while others stood by with medical equipment. Everyone involved understood that they were racing against time. Dr. Foster monitored Sarah's responses to the tapping communications. She was concerned that the signals were getting weaker as the hours passed. After 3 weeks trapped without proper food or water, Sarah's body was running on its last reserves. If they didn't reach her soon, even a successful rescue might come too late. The first major breakthrough came after 18 hours of work. The team had managed to create a small opening in the debris, barely large enough to drop a thin camera cable through. For the first time, they could actually see Sarah. The images transmitted to the surface were both hopeful and heartbreaking. Sarah was conscious, but extremely weak. She was lying on her side in a space no bigger than a closet. Her legs were trapped under a fallen beam and her clothes were torn and dirty. But she was alive, and when she saw the camera, she managed to wave weakly at her rescuers. The cheer that went up from the rescue team could be heard across the entire compound. Dr. Foster immediately began planning for medical intervention. They lowered a thin tube through the opening to provide Sarah with small amounts of water and liquid nutrients. An oxygen line was also inserted to help her breathe more easily. These measures would help stabilize her condition while the rescue work continued. The most dangerous part of the operation was still ahead. The beam that had protected Sarah by creating her survival space was also the main thing trapping her. Moving it would require extreme precision. If it shifted the wrong way, it could crush her instantly. Hayes and his engineering team spent hours calculating the exact sequence of moves needed to free Sarah safely. Rodriguez stayed in constant communication with military headquarters, providing updates every 30 minutes. The story had begun to leak to the news media, and reporters were gathering outside the military base. The idea of someone surviving for weeks underground had captured public attention around the world. The critical moment arrived on the second day of the rescue operation. Hayes and his team had carefully positioned hydraulic jacks and support cables around the massive steel beam that pinned Sarah's legs. The plan was to lift the beam just a few inches, while simultaneously pulling Sarah to safety through the opening they had created above her. Dr. Foster had inserted a stronger medical line through the opening, allowing her to monitor Sarah's vital signs in real time. Sarah's heart rate was weak but steady. Her blood pressure was dangerously low from weeks of dehydration and blood loss. Foster knew that moving Sarah could cause her body to go into shock, but leaving her trapped any longer would certainly mean death. The rescue team practiced the extraction procedure several times using a dummy. Every movement had to be perfectly coordinated. Rodriguez would direct the operation while Chen and Price positioned themselves to grab Sarah the moment she was free. Dr. Foster stood ready with emergency medical equipment, and Hayes monitored the structural stability of the surrounding debris. Sarah could hear the intense activity above her. Through the small opening, she could see lights and faces looking down at her. The rescuers had been talking to her constantly, explaining what they were about to do and encouraging her to stay strong. She had used the last of her energy to prepare herself mentally for what she knew would be the most dangerous part of her ordeal. When Rodriguez gave the signal, everything happened very quickly. The hydraulic jacks began lifting the steel beam with a loud groaning sound. Sarah felt the pressure on her legs decrease for the first time in 3 weeks. At the same moment, strong hands reached down through the opening and grabbed her under her arms. The extraction took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Sarah's legs were severely damaged and she screamed in pain as she was lifted, but she was free. For the first time in 22 days, Sarah Mitchell saw sunlight. The rescue team cheered as Dr. Foster immediately began working to stabilize her condition. Sarah was conscious but barely able to speak. Her first words were "thank you," whispered to the SEALs who had pulled her to safety. Rodriguez later said it was the most emotional moment of his military career. This woman had survived something that should have been impossible, and his team had been able to bring her back to the world of the living. Dr. Foster's medical team worked frantically to prepare Sarah for transport. Her legs were badly fractured and infected. She had lost over 30 pounds during her ordeal. Her kidneys were failing from dehydration, and she showed signs of severe malnutrition. But miraculously, her vital organs were still functioning, and her brain showed no signs of permanent damage. Within 2 hours of the rescue, Sarah was loaded onto a medical helicopter for transport to the nearest military hospital. The helicopter flight would take 90 minutes, during which Dr. Foster and her team would work to stabilize Sarah's condition. They started IV fluids immediately and began treating her infected wounds. The news of Sarah's rescue spread around the world within hours. Television networks interrupted regular programming to report that a woman who had been declared dead and buried 3 weeks earlier had been found alive. The story seemed impossible to believe, but video footage of the rescue confirmed that it was real. In Ohio, John and Mary Mitchell were on a military transport plane heading to Walter Reed Medical Center. They had been told that their daughter was alive but in critical condition. The emotional whiplash of losing Sarah, grieving for her, and now learning she might survive was almost too much to bear. They held hands and prayed during the entire flight. The military faced an unprecedented situation. How do you explain that someone who had been officially declared dead, whose funeral had been held and whose grave had been visited by hundreds of mourners, was actually alive? The Pentagon appointed a special team to handle the media attention and investigate how such a massive error had occurred. Sarah arrived at the military hospital in Germany 12 hours after her rescue. She was immediately taken into surgery to repair her damaged legs and treat her infected wounds. The surgical team worked for 8 hours, fighting to save her legs and address the internal damage caused by weeks of trauma and starvation. Dr. Michael Brennan, the lead surgeon, had never seen a case like Sarah's. The human body's ability to survive under such extreme conditions was remarkable.
Sarah had managed to stay alive by rationing tiny amounts of water,
staying as still as possible to conserve energy, and maintaining an incredible will to survive. When Sarah woke up after surgery, the first person she saw was Dr. Foster, who had stayed with her throughout the transport and operation. Sarah's voice was still weak, but she managed to ask about her parents. Dr. Foster smiled and told her that John and Mary Mitchell were on their way and would be there when she was strong enough for visitors. The psychological impact of Sarah's experience was as significant as the physical trauma. She had spent over 3 weeks in complete darkness, believing that she might die alone and forgotten. The knowledge that she had been declared dead and buried while she was fighting for her life was emotionally devastating. But Sarah also felt overwhelming gratitude. She was alive because of the skill and dedication of the Navy SEALs who had heard her call for help. She was alive because engineers and doctors had worked around the clock to free her. Most importantly, she was alive because she had never given up hope, even in her darkest moments underground. 3 days after her rescue, Sarah was stable enough to be transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland. The military had arranged for the most advanced care possible, understanding that her case was both medically complex and politically sensitive. Sarah's survival had become international news, and the hospital was dealing with constant media attention. The reunion between Sarah and her parents was emotional beyond words. John and Mary Mitchell had been waiting at Walter Reed for 2 days, barely sleeping as they anxiously waited for their daughter to arrive. When they finally saw Sarah being wheeled into the intensive care unit, both parents broke down in tears. Sarah was awake but very weak. Her legs were in casts and numerous tubes and monitors were attached to her body. But she was alive and she was their daughter. Mary held Sarah's hand gently while John struggled to find words. How do you talk to someone you buried 3 weeks ago? How do you process the grief you felt and the joy you feel now? Sarah's first concern was reassuring her parents that she was going to be okay. Despite everything she had endured, her first instinct was to comfort the people she loved. She apologized for putting them through the pain of thinking she was dead. John told her never to apologize for surviving, for being the strongest person he had ever known. The medical team at Walter Reed was amazed by Sarah's recovery. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the hospital's chief of trauma surgery, had expected Sarah to need months of intensive care. Instead, Sarah was showing remarkable resilience. Her body was responding well to treatment, and her infected wounds were healing faster than anticipated. However, the psychological challenges were significant. Sarah was experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. She had nightmares about being trapped in darkness. Loud noises made her panic, reminding her of the explosions that had buried her. She was afraid to be alone even for a few minutes. Dr. Patricia Collins, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma recovery, began working with Sarah immediately. Dr. Collins explained that Sarah's psychological response was completely normal, given what she had experienced. The human mind was not designed to cope with 3 weeks of solitary confinement in life-threatening conditions. Sarah also struggled with survivor's guilt. She learned that 2 of her colleagues had died in the same attack that buried her. She wondered why she had survived when they had not. Dr. Collins helped Sarah understand that her survival was not something to feel guilty about, but rather a testament to her incredible strength and will to live. The story of Sarah's survival continued to captivate people around the world. Letters and flowers arrived at Walter Reed from strangers who had heard her story. Children sent drawings and cards. Veterans shared their own stories of survival and recovery. Sarah was touched by the outpouring of support from people she had never met. Commander Rodriguez and his SEAL team visited Sarah during her second week at Walter Reed. The meeting was emotional for everyone involved. Rodriguez told Sarah that finding her had been the most meaningful mission of his career. Sarah thanked each team member personally, telling them that they had literally given her back her life. Chen, the SEAL who had first heard Sarah's tapping, brought her a small gift, a piece of concrete from the rubble where she had been trapped. He had it engraved with the date of her rescue and the words "Never give up." Sarah treasured this reminder of her survival and the people who had saved her. The military investigation into how Sarah had been declared dead was ongoing. Initial findings suggested that the extreme chaos following the attack had led to incomplete search procedures. The rescue team had been forced to evacuate quickly due to security concerns, and Sarah's location in the most damaged part of the building had made it nearly impossible to conduct a thorough search. Sarah's case led to immediate changes in military search and rescue protocols. New procedures were implemented requiring extended search periods and more sophisticated detection equipment. The goal was to ensure that no one else would ever be abandoned while still alive in similar circumstances. Media interviews became part of Sarah's recovery process. She wanted to share her story to honor the people who had saved her and to inspire others facing difficult challenges. Her first television interview was watched by over 50 million people worldwide. Sarah spoke calmly about her experience, emphasizing the power of hope and the importance of never giving up. Sarah's physical recovery was progressing well, but doctors warned that she would face a long rehabilitation process. Her legs had been severely damaged and she would need multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy. There was uncertainty about whether she would walk normally again. But Sarah approached this challenge with the same determination that had kept her alive underground. The grave that had been marked with Sarah's name became a symbol of her remarkable story. The military arranged a ceremony to officially close the grave and remove the headstone. John and Mary Mitchell attended the ceremony, finally able to put behind them the nightmare of believing their daughter was dead. Sarah's nursing colleagues organized a celebration of her survival. The scholarship that had been created in her memory was renamed the Sarah Mitchell Survival Scholarship, supporting nursing students who demonstrated exceptional perseverance. Sarah was deeply moved by the way her story had been transformed from tragedy to triumph. 6 weeks after her rescue, Sarah was ready to begin the challenging process of rehabilitation. The doctors at Walter Reed had stabilized her medical condition, but the road to full recovery would be long and difficult. Sarah's legs had been severely damaged during her 3 weeks trapped under the rubble, and multiple surgeries had been needed to repair the fractures and treat the infections. Physical therapist Maria Rodriguez became Sarah's closest ally during this phase of recovery. Maria had worked with many trauma survivors, but Sarah's case was unique. The prolonged immobilization and muscle atrophy from being trapped required a specially designed rehabilitation program. Maria started with simple exercises to help Sarah regain basic movement and strength. The first time Sarah attempted to stand, she could only manage a few seconds before collapsing back into her wheelchair. Her legs were weak, and the pain was intense. But Sarah refused to be discouraged. She remembered the determination that had kept her alive underground, and she applied that same mental strength to her physical recovery. Sarah's parents moved to a hotel near Walter Reed so they could be with their daughter every day. John took extended leave from his job, and Mary put her real estate career on hold. They had already lost their daughter once, and they were determined to support her through every step of her recovery. The family grew closer than they had ever been before. The psychological healing was as important as the physical rehabilitation. Dr. Collins continued working with Sarah to address her trauma responses. Sarah still had nightmares about being trapped in darkness, and she experienced anxiety in confined spaces. Crowded elevators and small rooms made her panic. These reactions were normal, but they required ongoing treatment. Sarah found comfort in talking with other trauma survivors. Walter Reed arranged for her to meet with veterans who had overcome severe injuries and challenging recoveries. These conversations helped Sarah understand that her feelings were normal, and that recovery was possible, even when it seemed overwhelming. 3 months after her rescue, Sarah achieved a major milestone. She was able to walk across her hospital room using a walker. The journey was only 20 feet, but it represented a huge victory. Mary cried tears of joy watching her daughter take those first steps. For Sarah, walking again felt almost as miraculous as being rescued. Sarah's story continued to inspire people around the world. She received thousands of letters from people facing their own challenges. Cancer patients wrote about finding strength in her story. Accident victims shared how her example motivated their own recoveries. Sarah realized that her survival had meaning beyond her own life. It was giving hope to others. A documentary crew received permission to film Sarah's rehabilitation process. The resulting film, titled 22 Days, would later win several awards and be shown in hospitals and medical schools worldwide. Sarah participated in the project because she wanted people to understand both the reality of trauma recovery and the power of human resilience. The Navy SEALs who had rescued Sarah stayed in touch throughout her recovery. Rodriguez visited whenever he was in the area, and Chen called regularly to check on her progress. These men had literally saved her life, and Sarah considered them family. Their continued support meant everything to her during the difficult months of rehabilitation. Sarah's medical team was amazed by her progress. Dr. Warren had initially worried that Sarah might never walk again without assistance, but Sarah's determination and the excellent care she received at Walter Reed exceeded all expectations. Her body was healing remarkably well, and her spirit remained unbroken despite everything she had endured. As Sarah's physical condition improved, she began thinking about her future. She knew she wanted to return to nursing, but she also felt called to help other trauma survivors. Her own experience had given her unique insights into the recovery process. She began exploring ways to combine her medical training with her survival experience. Sarah started writing a book about her experience. The writing process was therapeutic, helping her process the trauma while also preserving her story for others. She wrote about the 3 weeks underground, but also about the amazing people who had saved her and supported her recovery. The book would later become a bestseller and inspire countless readers. The military investigation into Sarah's case was completed, resulting in significant changes to search and rescue procedures. Sarah was invited to testify before a congressional committee about her experience. Her testimony led to new funding for advanced rescue equipment and improved training for military search teams. Sarah's relationship with her parents had been transformed by their shared experience. The grief they had felt when they thought she was dead, followed by the joy of her survival, had created an unbreakable bond between them. They had learned not to take any moment together for granted. As Sarah's first Christmas since the rescue approached, she felt overwhelming gratitude. She was alive, she was walking, and she was surrounded by people who loved her. The holiday that she had almost not lived to see became the most meaningful celebration of her life. Sarah understood that every day was a gift, and she was determined to make the most of the second chance she had been given. 1 year after her rescue, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium of the International Conference on Trauma Recovery, addressing an audience of doctors, nurses, and trauma survivors from around the world. She walked to the podium without assistance, her recovery so complete that few people in the audience would guess what she had endured. Her speech that day would become one of the most watched presentations in medical conference history. Sarah had returned to nursing 6 months earlier, but in a new capacity. She now worked as a trauma recovery specialist at Walter Reed, helping other patients navigate the difficult journey from injury to healing. Her unique perspective as someone who had survived an extreme trauma made her incredibly effective in this role. Patients trusted her because she truly understood what they were going through. The book Sarah had written about her experience, titled Buried Alive: 22 Days Underground and the Power of Hope, had become an international bestseller. The proceeds from the book funded a new foundation that Sarah had established to support trauma survivors and their families. The foundation provided financial assistance, counseling services, and support groups for people recovering from severe injuries. Commander Rodriguez had been promoted and was now leading SEAL training programs that incorporated lessons learned from Sarah's rescue. The techniques developed during her extraction had been refined and were now standard procedure for urban rescue operations. Rodriguez often told new SEAL recruits about Sarah's case as an example of why they should never give up on a rescue mission. Sarah's relationship with her parents had grown even stronger over the past year. John had returned to work but now volunteered with veterans organizations in his spare time. Mary had become an advocate for military families, speaking about the unique challenges faced by families who lose loved ones in combat zones. The experience of almost losing, Sarah had motivated both parents to help others facing similar situations. The changes in military search and rescue procedures that resulted from Sarah's case had already saved lives. 3 months earlier, soldiers trapped in a collapsed building in Syria had been found alive after 4 days. Because rescue teams used the new extended search protocols, the advanced detection equipment that had been purchased following Sarah's case had located the soldiers when traditional methods would have missed them. Sarah still experienced some effects from her trauma. She occasionally had nightmares and she preferred not to be in small enclosed spaces for extended periods, but she had learned to manage these responses, and they no longer controlled her life. Dr. Collins continued to work with Sarah, and their sessions had evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing wellness maintenance. The grave that had once marked Sarah's supposed burial site had been converted into a memorial garden for military medical personnel who had died in service. Sarah had suggested this transformation, wanting something positive to come from the mistake that had declared her dead. The garden had become a place of reflection and healing for families of fallen medical workers. Sarah's story had inspired changes beyond just military procedures. Hospitals around the world had reviewed their own disaster response plans. New technologies had been developed for detecting survivors in collapsed buildings. Sarah's case had become a textbook example in medical schools of the human body's incredible capacity for survival under extreme conditions. The Navy SEALs who had rescued Sarah remained close friends. Chen had been promoted to sergeant and was now training new Navy SEALs in rescue techniques. Price had completed his military service and become a firefighter, using the skills he had learned in the military to save lives in civilian emergencies. The entire rescue team stayed in regular contact, bonded forever by the mission that had saved Sarah's life. Sarah had also reconnected with colleagues from the medical compound in Afghanistan. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, who had survived the attack, visited Sarah in the United States. Their reunion was emotional, as both had thought the other was dead. Dr. Hassan told Sarah that her survival had given hope to everyone who worked in dangerous medical missions around the world. The documentary about Sarah's rescue and recovery had won an Academy Award, bringing even more attention to her story. Sarah used the platform to advocate for better support for military medical personnel and their families. She testified before Congress multiple times, helping to secure funding for improved medical facilities and support services. Sarah's personal life had also flourished. She had begun dating Mark Thompson, a fellow trauma recovery specialist she had met at Walter Reed. Mark was a veteran who had lost his leg in an explosion and understood both the challenges of recovery and the strength required to overcome them. Their relationship was built on mutual understanding and shared dedication to helping others heal. As Sarah looked back on the 2 years since her rescue, she felt a profound sense of purpose. The 3 weeks she had spent buried underground had been the worst experience of her life, but they had also led to the most meaningful work she had ever done. Every day she helped other trauma survivors, she was reminded that her survival had been about more than just her own life. Sarah often thought about the moment when she first heard the Navy SEALs tapping back in response to her SOS signals. That sound had represented the difference between life and death, between hope and despair. Now she worked every day to be that sound for others. The voice that says you are not alone, help is coming, and survival is possible. The little girl who had dreamed of becoming a nurse to help people had grown into a woman whose story of survival inspired millions around the world. Sarah Mitchell had been declared dead and buried, but she had fought her way back to life. Now she spent every day helping others find their own path back to the light.